Thank you, Eva. So John has very generously invited me to say a few words about universal income and unions. Now, before I go on, I just want to make clear these are my views. They're not the views of my employer, United Voice, and certainly not the views of the union movement. I think it's fair to say there's no consensus in the union movement about universal basic income. There's been very little public articulation of a position in Australia. I think there's a sort of there is a tradition, a labourist tradition, that perhaps is best exemplified by Chris Bowen's very dismissive comments around universal basic income at a recent seminar, where he said, "We're the Australian Labor Party, the clue's in the name." But I guess tonight I want to speak from a different tradition in unionism, and it's a marginal and somewhat forgotten tradition, and that's the tradition of feminist unionists in the post-suffrage period, so around 1910 to 1950. These are women like Lillian Locke, Jean Daly, Muriel Hegney. These are women that didn't accept a binary between work and anti-work politics. Their politics started with the idea of human interdependence. They campaigned for changes in the workplace and in the way that acts of social citizenship were treated in the home at the same time. So they advocated for equal pay at work for women, but they also advocated for a range of citizenship-based entitlements for maternity allowances and the child endowment. And their arguments were based on a notion of social reciprocity. There were two strands. One, there should be economic security for the work of care, that the work of mothers looking after small children was an act of citizenship, just as much as soldiers fighting in war was an act of citizenship. And secondly, they thought that motherhood should be separate from wifehood as a basis through which those entitlements were received. So thinking historically about this notion of starting from a point of social responsibility, social contribution and social reciprocity, we can trace a range of historical changes in our welfare state. The old age pension was arguably introduced initially as a way of acknowledging the past service of citizens to the nation state. CDP program in the 1970s was a way of recognising traditional forms of service and reciprocity within remote Indigenous communities. And I would argue, even if we drill down to arguments that are seen as being quintessentially union arguments about reduced working hours, so the classic stonemasons strikes of the 1850s that led to the 8-hour day, the arguments advanced in those times were about having reduced hours allowed the men in question to be better citizens. So in my mind, citizenship and social reciprocity has to be at the heart of UBI advocacy. However, there is no room for nostalgia and going back in this conversation. We need to think very acutely about 21st century conditions and the challenges we face. It is true that automation is replacing and already has replaced vast amounts of routine work in those middle skill, middle income jobs in the way that Tim's outlined. We are in a crisis in relation to the levels of carbon in the atmosphere and the levels of pollutions in our sea and the sky. We live in conditions of gender inequality where women still do the majority of care work in the home. They also are vastly overrepresented in the caring industries where the work of care is commodified. So notwithstanding us formally stepping away from the male breadwinner model, we are living in the shadow of that model still, and it casts a long shadow. We're also living the long legacy of colonisation. And yet, with all these challenges, we find that the most useful and important work for the 21st century is also the least valued, and that is the work of care. So notwithstanding everything that Tim says, and I thoroughly understand it about the jobs apocalypse, shall we say, I would also point to strands of continuity with what went in the past. So in conditions of high levels of automation, in conditions of climate change, some things will remain the same. We will still have the work of looking after human bodies. We will still need stewards of the land and the sea and the sky. We will still need to reproduce culture. We will still have jobs that require empathy and judgment and relationships. whether we have the technological changes that are coming to us allow for that relating work to be expanded and done more generously and with more time is a matter for politics, and it's a matter for fighting. At the moment, what might be seen as like a quintessentially 21st century job, working, for instance, as an aged carer, at the moment is subject to high levels of Taylorism and scientific management. So techniques of extracting labour developed in contexts around manufacturing to an aspect of human activity to which it is wholly unsuited. The idea that you can somehow do the work, you turn what is a relationship into a task and a gig that is subject to surveillance and being done efficiently is utterly antithetical to the nature of care, and it takes you to some pretty extreme places. So the aged care workers that we represent in United Voice are instructed by their employer to not get too close to the people that they care for. They are disciplined if they spend more than 5 minutes over their allotted time. They are told off for buying toilet cleaner with their own money on their own time to clean the toilets of the people they look after for. So we're in a fairly grotesque place, I think. The challenges are huge for reorienting our society in a way that puts that work of care and the work of that cyclical work that is required to maintain human systems and to maintain the environment. And I would argue we can't afford to be agnostic about the way people spend their time. We actually need a positive vision for what we value and how and who is going to do that work. So my thoughts towards UBI are quite ambivalent. I have some concerns, I suppose, that I guess I'd just like to share with you. One is that I feel as though UBI needs to be supportive of the fight for better jobs. We can't afford to be fatalistic about the idea that all this work that is the most useful, often motivated by a sense of intense vocation and is the most necessary, is necessarily going to be bad jobs, going to be low quality jobs, going to be insecure jobs. They don't need to be. And in fact, I would say we've forgotten. We tend to think that insecure work is sort of a new phenomenon of the late 20th century, early 21st century. It wasn't. The late 19th century was absolutely typified and characterised by high levels of casualisation, high levels of job insecurity, long supply chains that were being used deliberately to evade labour standards. So we fixed that before. We fixed that with this amazing idea about the state intervening in a systematic way to set a living wage. So we can fix that again. I just don't think we need to accept that certain categories of jobs are bad jobs. I also don't think we need to accept that the only tool for tackling those jobs is to say that we need to introduce measures so that people can walk away from them. I think it is too early to give up on that amazing union idea of organising. And organising simply means having a conversation with a fellow worker and saying, how can we make things better if we work together? And that relies on staying rather than leaving. So I don't think we should give up on that. And if we're not giving up on that, we also shouldn't be giving up on changing the laws to allow unions to become institutionally stronger and perform the range of public benefits that they perform, which means increasing levels of democracy and reducing inequality in the workplace and in society more generally, and being a crucial node for the redistribution of income and wealth. I should also say that there are workers who work in these in-service jobs that are themselves fighting as we speak and winning to improve their jobs, and we need to respect them and note them. So workers in early childhood education and care won a huge fight for national quality standards. They're currently fighting for professional levels of pay. Workers in aged care are fighting for more time to do their care and for greater career pathways. Digital networks are in place that are allowing workers in the most disaggregated sections of the labour market to connect online, to talk to each other, to make their jobs better. So UBI can't be an excuse for welfare wages, and it can't be an excuse for keeping those jobs low. Next, UBI also needs to support the fight against marketisation. We have many of our essential services given over to the private sector, and an acceptance of this being an appropriate matter for profit making by private corporations I think if we believe in the market being democratised, we should not accept this, and we should not be naive about how we can move power, how that power, people will not give up that power without a fight. So at the moment we have multinational corporations who are, own significant sections of the early childhood education market. Some CEOs, one particular multinational corporation pays its CEO $5.2 million and is openly committed to only paying its workers the statutory minimum. I should say that's in a US context, but it's a multinational who also owns significant numbers of institutions in Australia. We can't use UBI as an excuse to dismantle the welfare state. We simply must not do this. And I know no one on this panel is suggesting that nature of UBI, but nevertheless it's worth saying, if our welfare state was replaced by a system of flat payments, it simply sets up a system that punishes people, anyone with special needs, and indeed the liberationist potential of UBI would only flow to people who are able-bodied and have no caring obligations whatsoever. And I don't think that's a regressive measure we must avoid. And finally, we cannot yet let it interfere or distract from the fight against capital accumulation. We know from Piketty's research that we have an acute problem of inequality that must be tackled using many different measures, and we're on the brink of moving back to a moment of the Belle Epoque where essentially people's life chances are determined by systems of patrimony and whether or not they happen to have a share of property. So we need to move towards a property-owning democracy. So just to finish up, I think we need, as many speakers have said today, we need to insist on a return to the idea of citizenship rather than consumption at the heart of politics. We need to recognise and embrace automation. We need to recognise and embrace a deep, significant, meaningful transition to a low-carbon economy. And part of that is going to be giving adequate time, support and economic security to people who perform high-touch relational work, whether it's in a workplace or in their homes, and in conditions of gender and race equality. So what we need, I think, is a movement, not just a payment. Thanks.